My name is Alexandra Carter. I'm 32 years old, born and raised in Boston, an attorney who believed in doing everything right, planning, preparing, building a life brick by brick, and yet, here I was, staring at two of the people I trusted most, tangled in linen that smelled like champagne and orchids instead of the promise we'd written into our vows. Before I take you through how I turned that one moment into a complete reversal of the entire wedding, flipping 500 guests, his powerful family, and even the venue against them, do me a favor. Like this video, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. Because you'll want to hear how a single phone call changed everything. The truth is, I wasn't looking for trouble when I opened that door. My makeup artist had just finished the final touches. My dress was steaming in the corner, ready for me to slip into. I'd been told Justin was in his suite reviewing some last-minute vendor details with Heather, which wasn't unusual. Heather had been helping with planning for months. But when she didn't answer my texts and the front desk told me Justin's keycard access showed him still upstairs, I decided to personally deliver the engraved watch I'd bought him as a wedding morning gift. I didn't knock. I slipped the card in the lock and stepped inside. The light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows didn't allow shadows to soften what I was seeing. Justin's tuxedo pants were on the chair. Heather's silk robe was crumpled on the carpet. Their bodies fit together too perfectly for it to be an accident. And the worst part? They weren't startled when the door opened. Heather's eyes opened slowly, like she'd just been woken from a pleasant dream. And Justin froze, but didn't scramble to hide. It was as if they both knew, on some level, that I would find out eventually. For a few seconds, I just existed in that silence. I could hear the muffled sound of the quartet rehearsing somewhere downstairs. A champagne cork popped in the reception hall. It was surreal, this collision of two worlds, the one I had planned and the one I had just walked into. Then, the lawyer in me took over. I noticed the details, the lipstick stain on the pillow, his tie draped over the nightstand, her necklace, my gift to her 2 Christmases ago, glinting against his chest. I pulled out my phone. One close-up, one wide shot. I didn't care about ruining the day anymore. I cared about never letting anyone gaslight me into thinking this wasn't real. I backed out slowly, letting the door click shut behind me, my breathing unnaturally steady. The hallway smelled like hotel carpet cleaner, sterile and too clean for the mess my life had just become. I could have called my mother, but she would have stormed up here in fury, and I didn't want chaos. Not yet. I needed precision. I needed someone who could manage fallout without losing control. That's when I called Donna Mendez, Heather's mother. She's been the church's event coordinator for 20 years, the kind of woman who can calm a room full of angry parents during a school fundraiser and still remember who's allergic to shellfish. She'd braided my hair for school dances when I was 12. She'd made me soup when I was sick in law school. And she had a voice that could make the guilty confess without a single raised word. She answered on the second ring. "Donna," I said, my voice so flat it didn't sound like mine. "It's Alexandra. I need you upstairs right now. Bring your purse." There was a beat of silence, long enough for me to know she understood the weight in my tone, before she said, "I'm coming." I hung up and leaned against the wall, my dress robe puffing around me like a parachute that hadn't opened. My phone buzzed, the florist confirming delivery, my cousin sending a lobby selfie, Justin's best man asking where the rings were. I silenced the notifications. Every message felt like a reminder of the machine I'd been feeding for months, a machine now grinding to a halt. When the elevator opened, Donna stepped out, pearls steady against her navy blouse, her expression unreadable, but her eyes searching mine. She didn't ask what happened. I pointed at the door. She went in without knocking. I didn't follow. I stood in the hallway and listened for her reaction. It came in the form of a small, sharp inhale, the kind you make when you burn your hand but don't want to admit it stings. A moment later, she stepped out, closing the door softly. Her jaw was set. "We'll handle this," she said, her voice low but certain. And right there, in that sterile hallway, I felt something shift. I'd started the morning as a bride. Now I was something else entirely. Someone who was about to take control of a day that was supposed to belong to them, and make it mine again, in a way they'd never forget. Donna's presence in the hallway carried the weight of a verdict before a jury had even been called. She didn't waste energy on disbelief or moral outrage, she simply assessed the terrain. In that moment, Alexandra felt less like a jilted bride and more like a client about to be led through a courtroom battle. The air in the corridor was still, heavy with the faint scent of fresh orchids drifting from the ballroom below. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laugh broke through the muffled hum of hotel life, quickly swallowed again by silence. This hallway had become a holding space between two worlds, the one Alexandra had been living until minutes ago, and the one she would now have to navigate with surgical precision. Every step in the plan would need to be deliberate. In weddings, as in trials, perception was often more powerful than fact. It wasn't enough to know the truth. The truth had to be witnessed, anchored in the minds of those whose opinions would carry weight. Alone, she could be dismissed as a hysterical bride, driven by nerves or suspicion. With the right eyes on the scene, no one could dispute what had happened. Donna's movements were efficient, almost mechanical, as she began the process of assembling the necessary witnesses. She knew exactly who would be needed, figures with both personal and public credibility, whose words could withstand the distortions that would follow. She would summon Justin's parents, whose approval had once felt like a guarded prize. She would call Michael, the younger brother who often carried more quiet influence in family matters than his elder sibling. She would bring her own husband, whose presence in community affairs was a guarantee of seriousness. And she would involve the pastor, because when the moment came to halt the ceremony, his was the voice everyone in that room would follow. While Donna moved through her contact list, Alexandra paced the hallway in slow, measured steps, her hands trailing along the textured wallpaper. She thought about the photographs still sitting on her phone. They were raw and inelegant, untouched by filters, proof of a truth so sharp it didn't need enhancement. She thought about the guests in the ballroom, some of whom had flown across the country, dressed in their finest clothes, expecting to watch a love story reach its pinnacle. She thought about the staff, the caterers, florists, musicians, who had executed their roles to perfection, unaware they were working toward a day that was already collapsing. The first arrival came quickly. The quiet ding of the elevator broke through the low hum of the air conditioning. Michael stepped into the hallway, a garment bag slung over his shoulder, his stride casual until his eyes settled on Alexandra and Donna. That casualness dissolved in an instant. Without needing to be told, he walked to the door and swiped in with a universal key card. The sound of the door clicking open felt like a gavel striking wood. Seconds later, he emerged again. His expression altered, the easy lines of his face replaced by the pale stillness of someone who had just witnessed something that could not be undone. The pattern repeated itself as the others arrived. Justin's parents approached with brisk, purposeful steps, their posture betraying the belief that whatever had brought them here would be quickly resolved. But when they crossed the threshold into that suite, the air changed. They stayed inside longer than Michael had, long enough for the silence in the hallway to grow dense. When they finally returned, their faces carried the pinched, shadowed look of people who had seen not just an incident, but the ripple of what it would mean for them. The hallway was now filled with the subtle movements of bodies shifting in place, the sound of breaths drawn in and released with weight. Each person who stepped into that room and came back out joined an unspoken agreement. The wedding, as it had been planned, would not happen. The only remaining question was how it would end, and who would control that ending. Donna's final call brought the pastor. He arrived with a calm that felt out of place in the charged air of the hallway, his presence tall and steady. He entered the suite without hesitation, stayed for only moments, and returned with the same quiet steadiness, carrying the authority to stop the day in its tracks when the time came. The group moved together toward the elevator, a slow procession bound by a shared understanding. No one spoke. The carpet beneath their steps muffled the sound, but not the weight of what they carried. Alexandra felt herself almost outside her own body, observing the scene as if it were a deposition. Each person a key witness, each moment a piece of evidence to be placed in order. The descent to the ballroom level was brief, but the silence inside the elevator was long. Faces were turned forward, eyes fixed on the brushed steel doors, expressions guarded. Alexandra felt the shift in her own posture, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. She had entered this day as a bride. She was leaving the elevator as something else entirely. The doors opened to the warm glow of the ballroom level. The scent of polished wood floors and catered hors d'oeuvres hung in the air. Laughter drifted from somewhere near the bar. Glassware clinked as servers made their rounds. The space looked untouched by the storm that had been gathering upstairs. But Alexandra knew the atmosphere was about to change. Within minutes, the carefully arranged order of the day would dissolve into something raw and unrehearsed. The guests would gather in the reception hall, expecting joy, and would be handed truth instead. The arch of roses would remain upright. The champagne would still be chilled, but the purpose of the gathering would be rewritten. Donna set the next phase into motion with the same quiet decisiveness she had used in the hallway. Staff members were discreetly instructed to prepare the room for an unscheduled announcement. The pastor remained nearby, ready to command attention with his presence alone. The witnesses who had seen the suite kept their distance from the other guests, their faces composed but unreadable. Standing at the edge of the ballroom, Alexandra looked across the space where she had once imagined dancing her first dance as a wife. The band's instruments were neatly arranged on the stage, the floral arrangements perfect in their symmetry. Everything in the room had been designed to celebrate a union that would now be dissolved before it began. She thought about the eyes that would be on her soon, some sympathetic, some curious, some calculating. She thought about the whispers that would follow, the way the story would spread beyond these walls into the city's gossip circles, the inevitable distortions. And she thought about the one thing she could still control, the first telling of the truth. In less than half an hour, that truth would no longer be hers alone. The minutes before the announcement moved differently, stretched and compressed at the same time. It was as if the room and the clock were conspiring to hold me still while pushing me forward. Every detail, every sound, was sharp enough to cut. The faint buzz of the lights above the reception hall, the muted shuffle of polished shoes against the ballroom's wood floor, the clink of glassware in the distance, all of it folded into the hum of anticipation that no one yet understood. Donna's quiet command had spread through the staff like a controlled current. Guests were being guided toward the reception hall under the pretense of a brief change to the schedule. Coats were draped over chairs, champagne flutes set aside as people migrated. From the far corner, I could see the floral arch that was supposed to frame the start of my married life. Its roses were perfect, too perfect for the jagged truth that was about to pass through them. I stayed near the edge of the room, my back against the cool wall, letting the scene form around me. The witnesses who had been upstairs moved deliberately among the guests, keeping their expressions neutral. They carried their knowledge like a concealed weapon, ready to be drawn if anyone questioned what was about to be said. I could feel the weight of their silent presence bolstering me. The Whitfields kept their distance, though I could sense their eyes on me. Margaret's posture was rigid, her hands clasped in front of her like she could hold together everything that had already fallen apart. William avoided my gaze entirely, his attention fixed on the floor, on his phone, on anything that wasn't me. Michael stood apart from his parents, his jaw set, a faint tension in his stance that made me think he was bracing for impact. I focused on my breathing. Inhale to the count of 4. Hold. Exhale. My body felt both foreign and familiar, as though I had stepped into a version of myself that had been waiting for a crisis to fully emerge. The dress robe I still wore felt heavier now, its fabric absorbing the heat of my skin and the adrenaline running through me. My hands were dry, my pulse even. It was a strange kind of calm, the kind that comes when there is no more room for indecision. Around me, the guests filled the space, their voices blending into a low murmur. Some laughed, oblivious. Others whispered, their eyes flicking toward the cluster of witnesses or toward me, sensing the unusual current in the air, but not yet grasping its source. Children darted between chairs, weaving through clusters of adults. The band members stood near their instruments, uncertain whether they should be preparing for music or for something else entirely. The pastor moved to the front of the room. His presence was subtle but commanding, drawing the room's focus without raising his voice or his hands. It was the signal that the moment was near. Donna stood close enough to me that I could feel her steadiness without looking at her. She had orchestrated the shift from upstairs to here without a single unnecessary word. The precision of it was almost beautiful. In my mind, I replayed the image from the suite, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of purpose. The way Heather's hair had fallen over her shoulder, the outline of Justin's hand on her back, the discarded tuxedo jacket. Those images were no longer just mine. They were the foundation of the truth I was about to release into the room. The transformation of the space was nearly complete. The guests, now gathered in loose semicircles, faced the front where the pastor stood. The hum of conversation began to fade, replaced by a quiet expectancy. The lighting seemed softer somehow, as though the room itself knew the tone was shifting. From where I stood, I could see the top of the staircase that led to the bridal suite. The door at the top remained closed. I wondered if Justin and Heather were still inside, if they were whispering frantic strategies to each other, if they believed they could salvage something from the wreckage. The thought didn't stir anger in me now. It was almost distant, like reading about strangers in a newspaper. My phone was in my hand, though I hadn't looked at it in several minutes. Messages and missed calls had been piling up. Vendors checking on timelines. Friends asking if I needed help with makeup or hair. A few from numbers I didn't recognize. Likely journalists or gossip accounts that had caught wind of whispers from someone in the building. The story was already leaking, and I knew that within hours it would travel farther than this ballroom. That was all the more reason to make sure my version was the first and clearest to be heard. The plan was simple in structure, complicated in execution. The pastor would call for everyone's attention. He would explain that there had been an unexpected development and invite me to address the guests directly. The witnesses would remain visible, their presence reinforcing the legitimacy of what I was saying. Donna would stand near the front, not to guide me, but to anchor me. I imagined the sound of the room going still. I imagined my own voice breaking that stillness, steady and measured. I imagined the ripple moving outward as each person processed the words, as eyes widened and heads turned. There would be no screaming, no public breakdown. This would not be a spectacle in the way they might expect. It would be a surgical removal of illusion, clean and irreversible. The seconds before the pastor began felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. The ground was still solid beneath my feet, but I knew that once I took the next step, there would be no return to it. My heart was not racing, but there was a pressure in my chest, like the air was denser here. My vision narrowed slightly, not from fear, but from focus. From the corner of my eye, I caught the smallest movement, the lift of the pastor's hand as he prepared to speak. The guests closest to him instinctively turned their attention forward, their conversations halting mid-sentence. The ripple began. One by one, heads turned, bodies angled, and the room became a single entity waiting for the first word. I straightened, my shoulders settling into their place, my chin lifting. This was no longer about the ceremony, or the day, or even about Justin and Heather. It was about standing in a moment that could have broken me and using it instead to define me. The murmur of the crowd faded entirely. The room was ready, and so was I. When the pastor's voice rose over the room, it did so without force, yet it cut through the air with ease. Every guest turned toward him, their bodies shifting, conversations falling silent. The atmosphere thickened, not with dread yet, but with the curiosity of an audience sensing the performance about to begin. He spoke briefly, explaining that an important matter had arisen and that the bride wished to address everyone before the ceremony could proceed. The murmur that followed was immediate. Heads leaned toward each other, brows furrowed, eyes darting from face to face in silent speculation. Some glanced toward the doors, as if expecting me to enter in my gown with an announcement of postponement due to a weather delay or a minor emergency. The truth, waiting in my chest, was heavier than any of them could have imagined. I stepped forward from my place at the edge of the room. The subtle scrape of my heels on the polished floor sounded louder than it should have. The semicircles of guests adjusted, bodies shifting so that the collective focus converged on me. Behind them, the floral arrangements framed the space with a deceptive serenity, roses still in perfect bloom, their beauty untouched by the reality about to unfold. The witnesses who had been in the suite stood apart but visible, their faces unreadable, their stillness deliberate. Their presence was the quiet scaffolding of the moment, proof that I wasn't walking into this space armed only with my own account. I began with my posture, shoulders squared, spine straight, chin level. My hands rested lightly in front of me, fingers laced, not to appear demure, but to keep them still. The temptation to clench them, to point, to gesture sharply toward the truth's direction was strong, but I knew restraint would carry more weight than motion. The first words left my mouth in a tone that was steady, low, and stripped of theatrics. I gave no preamble, no polite lead-in to cushion the blow. I spoke plainly, laying out what had happened in the bridal suite less than an hour earlier. I told them I had entered the room, that I had found my fiancé and my maid of honor together, and that I had taken steps to ensure the truth could not be denied or softened. Faces changed in increments, foreheads tightening, eyes narrowing, lips pressing into thin lines. The stillness of the room deepened. Some guests turned slightly, as though to confirm the reactions of those around them, searching for validation in each other's shock. Others stared straight at me, absorbing every word. I did not name Heather or Justin until the facts had been established. Only after the sequence of events was set, after the evidence had been described, did I place the names into the narrative. The sound of them in the air was different now, no longer familiar, no longer softened by the affection that had once attached to them. They became identifiers in a case file, belonging to the record of an incident rather than to my personal life. I explained that this was not a fleeting misstep, but a pattern, confirmed and witnessed by multiple people in the room. I let the presence of those witnesses speak for itself, each of them a silent pillar reinforcing the structure of my statement. My voice remained even. I allowed no tremor, no hint of a plea. The silence that followed the conclusion of my statement was unlike the murmured hush before it. It was denser, charged. It was the silence of a collective processing, the weight of truth settling into a space where expectation had been stripped away. I could feel it pressing in from all sides. the gaze of friends, extended family, colleagues, and acquaintances who would carry this story far beyond the walls of the ballroom. There was no applause, no audible reaction at first. The moment required a beat of stillness to sink fully into place. Then, from one corner, a faint sound of hands coming together, joined quickly by others. It wasn't the loud cheer of a crowd entertained, it was the sharp, decisive applause of people recognizing a line drawn cleanly in the sand. The applause faded almost as quickly as it began, replaced again by a focused quiet. I could feel my own breathing return to a slower rhythm. The control I had over my voice now spread through my limbs, grounding me. I had said what I came to say. There was no need to embellish, no urge to repeat. The pastor stepped forward again, his voice wrapping around the room with quiet authority, confirming that the ceremony would not proceed. He spoke of truth, of integrity, of how this day would move forward differently than planned. His words created a bridge from my announcement to the reality the guests now inhabited. From the back of the room, I sensed movement. I didn't need to turn to know that Justin had appeared, likely drawn by the shift in the room's energy. He would see the witnesses, the faces of his family, the stillness of the guests. He would understand that there was nothing left to salvage here. I didn't look for Heather. My mind no longer needed to place her in the space. She had been removed from the circle of relevance the moment I stepped forward and claimed the narrative for myself. As the pastor concluded, the guests began to move, not in the restless scatter of confusion, but in small, purposeful clusters. Some approached me, their expressions carrying quiet solidarity. Others lingered near the edges, watching, still absorbing. The witnesses remained visible, a steady presence reinforcing the certainty of what had been said. I stepped back toward the wall, the same position I had occupied before speaking, but the feeling was different now. The space I took up in the room had shifted. I was no longer the silent figure waiting to be addressed. I was the one who had addressed them, the one who had stood between a false ceremony and the truth. The music that had been playing softly in the background before the announcement did not return. Instead, there was a low hum of voices, the subdued clinking of glassware, the sound of people adjusting to a new version of the day. In that moment, I understood something that I had never truly grasped before. Power is not always about control of events, but about control of the telling. The events of the morning had been outside my control. The telling, however, was mine entirely. The roses still framed the front of the room, their petals unmarked. The champagne remained chilled. The first dance song would never be played. But the day had been reclaimed, not as a celebration of union, but as a declaration of self-respect. I stood there, breathing in the altered air of the room, and felt the foundation of something new settling beneath me. The applause had dissolved into a murmur of shifting conversations, the sound of champagne being poured, and the rustle of expensive fabrics as guests recalibrated their posture for a day they had not expected. Yet in the space between those sounds, I could feel the pressure building. It was no longer the collective anticipation of the crowd. It was the focused, calculated tension of the Whitfields. Their presence carried the weight of legacy and money, the kind of social gravity that could bend events toward their preferred narrative if left unchecked. They had been raised to believe that anything could be reshaped with the right words, the right faces in the right rooms. To them, the truth was not an absolute but a resource, something that could be managed, spun, or silenced for preservation's sake. They did not approach me immediately. They circled first, speaking in hushed tones with each other, moving with the deliberation of people assessing the battlefield before making a play. Their eyes cut toward me at intervals, measuring my posture, reading the set of my shoulders, calculating whether there was still room to negotiate. The guests, now scattered into smaller groups, created a buffer of movement and sound between us. Some had already shifted into casual conversation, as though the day's drama was now just another story to carry home. Others kept glancing toward me, their expressions a blend of sympathy and curiosity. But the Whitfields' gaze was different. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. Eventually, they moved in my direction. The approach was slow, as if closing the distance with too much urgency might betray their intent. They positioned themselves just close enough to speak without raising their voices, ensuring that whatever passed between us would not be overheard by the guests. The tone they adopted was one I had heard before in courtrooms and boardrooms. Low, even, devoid of overt emotion, but thick with persuasion. The cadence carried the rhythm of negotiation, each phrase designed to present a pathway away from public exposure. There were offers implied in their pauses, routes toward a version of the day that could be salvaged, at least in the eyes of their peers. The subtext was clear. They did not care about the truth, only about how small it could be made to look. I let their words reach me without interruption, holding my expression steady, my body unmoved. I recognized the tactic for what it was, layered reasoning meant to find the point where my exhaustion might outweigh my resolve, but exhaustion was a luxury I could not afford in this moment. My composure was not just for me. It was for every witness who had stood with me in that suite, for every guest in this room who had heard my voice claim the truth. They tried to frame the situation as temporary, a lapse in judgment that could be managed privately if handled correctly. They suggested that postponement would be the most dignified course, that I could frame it as illness, travel issues, even venue complications, anything but what had actually occurred. Their offers were not about kindness or concern. They were about containment. The weight of their expectations pressed against me like a physical force. I thought about the years I had spent building a career that relied on precision, on being able to stand in a room and hold the line against opposing arguments. This was no different. The stakes were personal, but the skill was the same. Maintain the ground you've claimed. Refuse to let the other side reframe the terms. My silence became its own form of answer. Without words, I made it clear that there would be no compromise, no diluted explanation to soothe the discomfort of those who had more to lose socially than I did emotionally. The Whitfields were not used to resistance that did not engage with their terms. It left them standing in the quiet space between persuasion and defeat, unsure how to proceed without the cooperation they assumed would come. Beyond them, the room had begun to shift again. Guests were moving toward the bar, taking seats at tables, engaging in quieter conversations. The initial shock was settling into the kind of acceptance that comes when people realize the story is already set. The witnesses remained visible, their calm presence reinforcing the legitimacy of what had been said. Justin had not yet appeared in the room. Whether it was by his choice or the Whitfields' instruction, I couldn't be certain. It didn't matter. His absence now was not an escape. It was a statement in itself, one that spoke of retreat rather than confrontation. The Whitfields eventually withdrew, their expressions unreadable, though I could sense the calculation still working behind their eyes. They would not concede, but they would adapt, seeking other avenues to control the narrative once the day was over. I had no illusions about that. This announcement had been a decisive moment, but it was not the final one. They would try again, in smaller ways, in quieter rooms, through people who believed they were acting in my best interest. But this room, today, was mine. The staff moved with professional efficiency, continuing to serve drinks and hors d'oeuvres, the illusion of celebration maintained for those who wished to linger. The band remained off stage, instruments untouched, their role rendered unnecessary by the turn the day had taken. The floral arch still stood, its symmetry unbroken, as though unaware it would never frame a union. I found a place near the far wall, allowing the rhythm of the room to settle without me in its center. From here, I could watch the flow of movement, the subtle shifts in body language, the way people's gazes lingered on me a moment too long before drifting away. Each glance was a confirmation that the story had landed. There was a strange steadiness in knowing the truth was now shared. It no longer lived solely in my mind, no longer risked being dismissed as suspicion or overreaction. It had been spoken, witnessed, and anchored in the collective memory of the room. No matter what came next, whether in whispers, in public retellings, or in the inevitable distortions, the foundation would hold. I remained still, letting that fact root itself inside me. Around me, the day continued in its altered form, the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses replacing what should have been vows and applause. It wasn't the ending I had envisioned, but it was an ending I had claimed. And that mattered more than anything the Whitfields could offer. Justin's absence could only stretch so far before it became more damning than his presence. The guests had adjusted to the altered rhythm of the afternoon, but the undercurrent of curiosity about where he was and how he would respond kept pulling attention toward the empty spaces in the room. His family had made their attempts to contain the fallout, but they could not indefinitely shield him from the weight of the witnesses or the stares of those who had heard the truth. I felt the shift before I saw him. Conversations slowed, heads turned slightly toward the entrance, and a subtle tightening in the air signaled the arrival of the person at the center of it all. When he finally stepped into the room, he did not carry himself like a man prepared to confront what had been laid out in his absence. His movements were careful, his posture taut, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of refuge. The witnesses did not move, but their stillness was a form of pressure. They held their positions as though they had been stationed there, not to guard me, but to ensure the truth had anchors in every corner of the room. Their faces were calm, their presence undeniable. Justin's gaze found me almost immediately, but it didn't hold. He looked away too quickly, a flicker of recognition in that moment that whatever passed between us here would not be on his terms. He lingered near the doorway for a breath too long before being drawn into the inevitable pull toward the cluster where his family stood. Margaret's expression was unreadable, William's harder to place, somewhere between frustration and resignation. Michael remained apart from them, his stance angled toward me, his face set in quiet solidarity. I didn't move toward Justin. I let the distance between us become part of the structure of the room, a physical reminder of the gap that had opened and could never be closed. The pressure to address the situation directly grew with each second he remained. The guests, already carrying the knowledge I had given them, shifted their attention like spectators awaiting the next act in a performance. Eventually, the Whitfields guided him forward, not in a gesture of support, but in the controlled way one moves a witness into position. The space that opened between us was small but deliberate, close enough that words could pass quietly, yet public enough that the witnesses and nearest guests could observe the exchange. His voice was low, but the tone carried the weight of an admission before the words even formed. The cadence of his sentences was halting, the kind that belongs to someone choosing each word with care, knowing that every syllable will be remembered. He confirmed the affair, not as an isolated mistake, but as something that had been sustained over months. He did not embellish, and he did not attempt to deny the scope of it. The choice to confess now in this space was not about integrity, it was about inevitability. Heather's absence was notable, her name hanging unspoken in the space between us even as her actions were laid out alongside his. Whether she had chosen not to face the room or had been kept away by others was irrelevant. Her absence did nothing to dilute the truth already fixed in place. The confession was not an apology. It was not dressed in remorse or wrapped in language designed to lessen the blow. It was factual, stripped to the bone, and that bareness made it all the more final. There were no pleas for reconsideration, no promises of change, no bargaining for a quieter resolution. He spoke the truth because there was no longer any utility in denying it. When he finished, the silence that followed was sharp, different from the earlier pauses in the day. This was not anticipation. It was the quiet of finality, the closing of a chapter that could never be reopened. The witnesses absorbed his words without reaction, their role not to respond, but to ensure that the record was complete. Justin stepped back slightly, the shift in his body language subtle but telling. He no longer carried the tension of someone holding a secret. Instead, there was the sagging posture of someone stripped of the illusion that they still controlled the narrative. His eyes did not seek mine again. Whatever he had hoped to find there, anger, pity, hesitation, was absent. The guests returned to their conversations slowly, the weight of the moment settling into the fabric of the day. For them, this would become a story to be recounted over dinners and phone calls, their version shaped by the exact angle from which they had witnessed it. For me, it was a formal close to a chapter that had been writing itself in shadows for far too long. I stayed still, my breathing steady, letting the room recalibrate again. The confession had not given me relief. It had given me clarity. There was no ambiguity left to navigate, no space for the kind of second-guessing that can creep in when betrayal remains unspoken. The truth had been named, witnessed, and anchored. That was enough. Justin lingered at the edge of the gathering for a while longer, orbiting conversations without fully entering them. His presence was tolerated but no longer central. The day was no longer about him, just as it was no longer about us. It was about the moment in which a false future had been dismantled and replaced with something honest, however painful. When he eventually left the room, he did so quietly, without ceremony. His departure drew only a few glances, the kind given when a figure exits a stage after their final scene. The story had moved past him now. I remained in the space, not because I needed to, but because I could. The room no longer felt like a place where I was bracing for impact. It felt like a place I had reclaimed. The arches, the flowers, the music that never played, all of it stood as silent witnesses to the choice I had made to speak, to stand, and to hold the line against the pressure to fold. This was no victory in the celebratory sense, but it was a victory of ownership. The truth had been mine to tell, and I had told it. And in the telling, I had taken back more than the day. I had taken back myself. The room shifted into something unrecognizable once the confession had been spoken aloud. It no longer carried the taut silence of withheld truth, nor the stiff posture of guests caught between politeness and curiosity. The air had loosened, but not into celebration. It was the looser air of a gathering whose central purpose had evaporated, leaving everyone free to decide for themselves how much longer they wished to remain. Small groups began forming naturally, as though the ballroom had reorganized itself into pockets of familiarity. Some guests gravitated toward the bar, their voices pitched low, not in secrecy but in the hushed register people instinctively adopt when discussing something heavy. Others took their champagne flutes and found seats along the edges, watching the movement around them with quiet detachment. There were still smiles, but they were polite now, almost ceremonial, offered out of habit rather than joy. The band had begun quietly packing away their instruments, their movements unhurried but deliberate. Their absence of music seemed to deepen the altered mood of the room, allowing the muted clink of glasses and the soft rustle of fabric to take its place. The absence was noticeable, but it was fitting. The space no longer called for melody. Donna remained a steady presence, never far from me but never hovering. Her work for the day had shifted from coordination to containment, ensuring that the guests who lingered did so without escalating tension. The witnesses still held their places, their calm presence reinforcing the certainty of what had happened. They no longer needed to be obvious. Their very proximity was enough to keep the truth anchored. Justin was nowhere to be seen now. Whether he had left entirely or retreated to some private corner of the venue, I didn't know. Heather remained absent as well, her invisibility almost a strategy in itself, an attempt, perhaps, to limit further damage by avoiding the gazes and whispers she would inevitably draw. Their absence created a vacuum in the center of the scandal, but it didn't pull focus from me. The story had already taken shape, and the central figures had been clearly named. I moved through the room slowly, not in a line of procession, but in a series of deliberate steps that allowed me to meet the eyes of the people who sought mine. Some offered nods, others brief touches on the arm, gestures meant to communicate solidarity without requiring words. I accepted them without breaking stride. This was not a time for consolation. It was a time for presence. My parents had been told privately before I made the announcement, and they now stood together near one of the tall windows, their posture a mixture of pride and quiet ache. They had not approached me since the reveal, perhaps understanding that I needed to hold my own ground before joining theirs. Even from across the room, I could feel their steady support. The food service had continued, trays of hors d'oeuvres circulating with mechanical precision, a reminder that the day's logistical framework remained intact even as its emotional framework had collapsed. Guests accepted the offerings out of habit, holding delicate plates in one hand while balancing the weight of an entirely different kind of conversation in the other. The hum of the room was different now, less expectant, more resigned. The early shock had faded into a kind of settled acknowledgement. People no longer craned their necks toward the doors, waiting for some reversal or twist. They knew the day's central arc had been completed, and what remained was simply the living out of its consequences. I found a seat near the far side of the room, where the light from the chandeliers was softer. From there, I could see the full expanse of the ballroom, the clusters of guests, the staff moving in their practiced paths, the empty space where the ceremony would have taken place. The arch of roses still stood, flawless in its construction, an artifact of a future that no longer existed. The longer I sat, the more the noise of the room blurred into a background hum, and my thoughts began to stretch forward. I thought about the hours to come, the phone calls, the explanations, the careful sorting of who needed to hear the truth directly and who could receive it through the inevitable chain of retellings. I thought about the weeks ahead, the legal untangling of what had been planned to bind us together. There would be contracts to adjust, deposits to reclaim or forfeit, arrangements to dismantle. None of it frightened me. The logistics were simply another form of taking control. The emotional weight was different. I could already sense the moments that would return uninvited in the days ahead, the image of the suite door opening, the stillness of their bodies, the way my own breath had felt unfamiliar in my chest. These would not be erased by my public stance today, but neither would they have the power to undo it. Gradually, guests began to slip away. Some offered polite goodbyes as they passed me. Others left quietly, their departure marked only by the soft closing of the ballroom doors. The crowd thinned until the space felt too large for those of us who remained. The energy in the room was no longer tense, just tired. When it was finally time to leave, I did so without ceremony. There was no gathering of belongings beyond the essentials, no lingering for one last look. The day had already been stripped of sentiment. I saw no reason to prolong it. Donna walked with me to the exit, her steps matching mine, her silence speaking more than words could have. The air outside was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of rain, even though the sky was still clear. The street was quiet, save for the occasional passing car. It felt almost detached from the events inside, as though I had stepped into a parallel version of the day where none of it had happened. But it had happened, and as I walked away from the venue, the weight I carried was not the collapse of the wedding. but the solid, unshakable knowledge that I had faced it without letting anyone else write my ending for me. The day was over. The work of rebuilding, in all its forms, was just beginning. The morning after the non-wedding, the city felt quieter than usual, but I knew it wasn't. It was the kind of deceptive stillness that comes before a story breaks through every circle it can reach. In Boston, bad news travels in two speeds, slow enough to let people savor it and fast enough to make sure no one is left out. My story was doing both. By the time I woke, my phone was already a catalog of reactions. Dozens of texts, voicemails, and notifications stacked into neat, suffocating columns. Some were from close friends, offering carefully worded sympathy, others from acquaintances trying to sound concerned while fishing for details. A few came from numbers I didn't recognize, but I knew what they wanted. In a city where weddings are as much a social showcase as a personal milestone, a scandal like mine was irresistible. I didn't rush to respond. Part of controlling a story is understanding that silence, when used deliberately, has its own kind of authority. The people who mattered had already heard the truth directly from me yesterday. Everyone else could wait. The urge to correct every rumor before it took root was strong, but exhausting myself in the first 24 hours would only weaken my position later. The first wave of misinformation was predictable. Whispers painted the scene as a misunderstanding, a stress-induced lapse, or, most absurdly, a fabricated drama to avoid cold feet. The Whitfields had clearly begun their containment strategy, filtering softer versions of events through sympathetic contacts. I could feel their fingerprints in the phrasing. In their version, the truth was always just out of reach, something implied but never stated. I countered quietly, selectively. Through trusted friends, I made sure the version I had delivered in the ballroom, the one anchored by witnesses, was repeated exactly. No embellishment, no emotional frills, just the bare sequence of what had happened and who had seen it. Precision was my weapon, speculation was theirs. The more exact I could be, the harder it would be for their revisions to gain traction. Legally, the unraveling was straightforward. The marriage license had not yet been signed, the contracts for the venue and vendors were under my name, and the only shared financial obligations were deposits I had personally funded. Justin's contribution to the wedding had been symbolic rather than substantial, his investment more in appearance than in infrastructure. Ending it on paper would be far cleaner than ending it in memory. Still, the legal clarity didn't shield me from the social complexity. The circles we moved in overlapped more than I had ever realized. Business associates who had met us as a couple now had to recalibrate how to approach me. Casual friends suddenly found themselves navigating invisible allegiances, some drifting toward me, others toward him, depending on what each stood to lose or gain. The most delicate part was handling the calls from people who claimed to be neutral. They wanted the truth, they said. But neutrality in these situations is rarely honest. What they wanted was to carry a definitive version of the story into their own circles, packaged in a way that gave them the air of being in the know. I learned quickly to give them nothing new. If they weren't in the ballroom yesterday, they wouldn't hear more from me today. Heather's name began surfacing in the background noise of these conversations, though rarely spoken aloud to me. The maid of honor turned mistress was too easy a headline to resist. In some ways, her role in the betrayal was more sensational than Justin's. Wedding betrayals are common enough, but the proximity of the friendship, the position she had held in my life, made the narrative sharper. She had been my chosen witness to the beginning of my marriage, and instead, she had become a witness to its end before it began. I didn't engage directly with her or with anyone connected to her. Every instinct told me that keeping my distance was more powerful than confrontation. Contact, even for the sake of closure, would give her relevance in my narrative, and she no longer had any place in it. In quieter moments, when the phone stopped vibrating for an hour or two, I found myself thinking about the way yesterday had unfolded. The order of events played in my mind like a perfectly constructed case file. The discovery, the gathering of witnesses, the public statement, the confession. Each step had been deliberate, each one building on the last to create a record that was impossible to erase. In that, there was a sense of stability, even comfort. What I didn't dwell on was the future of Justin and Heather. Whether they stayed together, collapsed under the weight of what had happened, or quietly drifted apart was irrelevant to me. My concern was not their next chapter. It was making sure mine began without their interference. By late afternoon, the chatter had started to evolve. The initial rush of shock was softening into something more sustainable, an ongoing conversation that would surface whenever people in our circles needed a story to tell. It would be referenced at dinners, over drinks, in passing comments. It would live for months, maybe years, in the casual way certain stories do, resurfacing not because it was fresh, but because it was unforgettable. I couldn't control that entirely, but I could shape my part in it. I would remain calm, consistent, and precise in every telling. No variations, no emotional flourishes to feed into the Whitfield's counter-narratives. Eventually, my steadiness would be the thing people remembered more than the betrayal itself. That night, I put my phone on silent and placed it face down on the table. The storm was still moving, but I had no intention of standing outside in it. I had already done what mattered most. I had spoken the truth, in public, with witnesses. The rest was noise, and I would not let it dictate my next move. In the weeks that followed, my life moved at two speeds. On the surface, it was a steady, deliberate pace. Work commitments resumed, errands were run, and the visible structure of my days fell back into place. Beneath that, the inner movement was more volatile, marked by sudden surges of memory, moments of stillness that felt almost paralyzing, and the quiet work of stitching together a self that no longer fit the shape it had before. The practical matters were easy enough to handle. The venue deposits were recovered in part, the rest forfeited without regret. The vendors were professional, their contracts clear. My dress went back into its garment bag and into a closet I didn't open often. I moved through these tasks with the detached efficiency of someone filing away a case they knew would never go to trial. The mechanics of ending a wedding were far less complicated than the mechanics of ending the life I had imagined beyond it. What surprised me most was not the sadness, I had expected that, but the sharp clarity that came with it. There was no room for confusion about who Justin was or what he had done. The ambiguity that can cloud a breakup was absent here. He had made his choices. I had responded. That simplicity became a strange kind of anchor, something that kept me from drifting into endless what-ifs. Still, the emotional terrain was uneven. Some mornings I woke with the weight of the ballroom still pressing against my ribs, as if I were back at the edge of the room, ready to speak. Other days, I felt a lightness that startled me, the kind that comes when you realize you've been spared a future that would have required 1,000 small compromises just to keep standing. I avoided the places where I might run into him, not out of fear, but because I saw no benefit in reopening the scene. The city was big enough, and my life full enough to make avoidance easy. Friends were careful too. Those who stayed close knew the unspoken boundaries, steering conversations away from him, from her, from the speculation about what they might be doing now. The hardest work happened in the quiet. Late at night, when the apartment was still, I would sit in the dark with a cup of tea cooling between my hands, tracing the shape of my own thoughts. I began to see how much of myself I had set aside in the years leading up to the wedding, how often I had folded my edges in to make room for his comfort. That realization was sobering, but it was also freeing. If I could identify the spaces I had abandoned, I could reclaim them. I started with small things. Weekend mornings became mine again, unclaimed by his habits. I signed up for a photography course I'd postponed twice because the timing hadn't suited our shared schedule. I rearranged my apartment, shifting furniture not for efficiency, but for how the space made me feel. Each change was minor on its own, but together they began to form a pattern. One that reminded me that life could be rebuilt not just from loss, but from choice. The social ripples continued, though they grew quieter with time. Occasionally, a new acquaintance would connect the dots between my name and the story they had heard, their expression flickering in recognition. I learned to meet those moments with calm. The more composed I was, the less oxygen the story had. In some ways, the scandal had become part of my public identity, but it didn't have to define it. There were days when anger returned, sharp and clean, usually sparked by something small, a careless comment, a reminder of a place we had been together, a photograph buried deep in a folder I'd forgotten to delete. I didn't try to suppress it anymore. Anger, I learned, was not the opposite of healing. It was part of it. A flare that lit the ground ahead so I could see what still needed to be cleared. By the third month, the story had begun to fade from the city's active gossip cycle. New scandals had replaced it in the conversations that thrived on such things. That shift brought its own strange mix of relief and unease. Relief that I was no longer the centerpiece. Unease at how quickly something so personal could be replaced in the public mind. It was a reminder that the only lasting weight the story carried was the one I gave it. With the outside noise dimming, I began to look forward more than back. I made plans without measuring them against what Justin might have wanted. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in years, relationships that had thinned during the insular years of my engagement. I traveled to places we had once talked about visiting, but never did. Not to rewrite those plans, but to claim them fully as mine. Healing, I realized, wasn't a straight line, but a series of overlapping circles. Loss, clarity, choice, and change, each one feeding into the next. The betrayal would always be a part of my history, but it no longer felt like the center of my story. It had become the moment that broke something open, making space for a version of myself I might never have reached otherwise. By the time spring came, I could walk past the hotel without the tightening in my chest that had gripped me for months. The suite, the hallway, the ballroom, they were still there, unchanged, but they no longer felt like mine to carry. They belonged to a day that had ended, and I had chosen not to stay in it. What lay ahead was uncertain, but it was mine entirely. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. By the time the first anniversary of the non-wedding arrived, the day no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a landmark, not a celebration, but a clear marker of distance traveled. The woman who had walked into that ballroom a year earlier was not the one standing in my mirror now. The change wasn't sudden. It had been built in layers, like a house restored brick by brick. Some days it was easy to see the progress. Other days it was only visible when I looked back over months. But it was there, in the way I carried myself, in the decisions I made without hesitation, in the absence of the quiet fear that had once kept me from speaking my mind too fully. Work had become a refuge, not because I hid in it, but because I allowed myself to own it completely. Without the constant pull of someone else's expectations, I could take on projects that excited me without worrying how they fit into another person's plans. My calendar was no longer a negotiation. It was mine to fill, to change, to clear entirely if I wanted to. The circle around me had shifted too. Some friends had fallen away, quietly choosing their side in the months after the wedding was called off. Others had grown closer, stepping into the space left behind with a loyalty that was steady and unspoken. I learned not to mourn the ones who left. Their absence made room for the people who truly saw me. Travel became one of my clearest ways of marking change. The trips I took that year were not escapes, they were expansions. I visited places we had once talked about but never prioritized. walking the streets not with the intention of replacing memories, but of writing entirely new ones. There was a quiet satisfaction in standing in a city square or on a coastal path and knowing that the moment belonged entirely to me. The public memory of the scandal had faded. It still lived in some corners, ready to be pulled out by someone who wanted to punctuate a dinner conversation with a sharp anecdote. But when my name came up now, it was as much for the way I had handled it as for the betrayal itself. I had not hidden, and I had not let it consume me. That, more than the event, had become my reputation. There were moments when Justin's name surfaced, through mutual acquaintances in the background of conversations I couldn't fully avoid. I learned that his relationship with Heather had ended quickly, though the details were vague. I felt no rush of satisfaction at the news, only a quiet acknowledgement that it had been inevitable. Their collapse was not my victory. My victory had been walking away before the damage could reach any deeper. The last tangible tie to the wedding was the dress. For months it had stayed in the garment bag, untouched, a relic of a day that had been rewritten. I had avoided it at first, then ignored it, as though it might quietly disappear if I didn't acknowledge it. Eventually, on a clear Saturday morning, I unzipped the bag. The sight of it no longer carried the sting I had feared. It was simply fabric now, stitched into a shape that no longer fit my life. I donated it to an organization that repurposed gowns for women starting over. It felt right that it might become part of someone else's new beginning. By summer, I began to think seriously about the future again, not as a plan to replace what I had lost, but as an open space to be filled. I didn't rush toward dating, though it found me eventually in small, unplanned ways. The first time I accepted an invitation for coffee, it felt less like a step toward someone else and more like a step toward a new version of myself, one that was open to possibility, but anchored in self-respect. Healing didn't mean forgetting. I could still recall every detail of that day. The chill in the suite's air, the weight of the silence after my announcement, the way my voice had sounded steadier than I felt. But those memories no longer lived in the present tense. They were part of the foundation I stood on, not the ground I walked. Strength, I learned, is not loud. It's not in the dramatic declarations or the perfectly timed comebacks. It's in the steady refusal to give away your own narrative, in the quiet decision to keep moving even when the road is unfamiliar. It's in showing up for yourself on the days when no one is watching. Now, when people ask about the wedding that wasn't, I tell them the truth plainly. I don't soften it, and I don't add weight to it. I let the facts stand on their own. Some respond with shock, some with admiration, and some with the discomfort of not knowing what to say. All of it is fine. My story doesn't need permission to exist. If this story has found its way to you, maybe because you've stood in a moment where the ground gave way beneath you, or because you've had to rebuild from something you never thought you'd face, I want you to know this. Your ending is yours to write. The worst day doesn't get to own you unless you hand it the pen. So if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've ever faced your own moment of truth, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Your voice matters here.